They repeatedly pointed to a highly scrutinized phone call between President Trump and Ukraine's leader. But we're going to take you back now to the hearing as it has resumed.
The gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
I would request that we enter into the record the FISA applications and other aspects of the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane.
I reserve a point of order.
I think if we're going to continue,
This is the reserving. What are you entering to?
the FISA report that just came up.
Oh, we need.
The Inspector General's report.
We'll
the genesis of this whole thing.
We'll take that under advice until we can review it, and we'll rule on it later. I mean, we'll hopefully grant it later.
I withdraw my reservation.
Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to follow up on the two series of questions that the ranking member, Mr. Collins, directed at Mr. Goldman relative to the telephone company subpoenas and the inclusion of certain information in the majority report from the Intelligence Committee. Let me say that there are two issues involved. One that is not involved is the legality of the subpoena. I believe that that was a subpoena that is fully authorized under the law and under congressional procedures. Where I do have a problem, and a really big problem, however, is the fact that somebody made a decision to match certain data, metadata that had been collected through the subpoena with phone numbers of journalists and members of Congress. And that is the beginning of a surveillance state, which I think is outrageous, particularly since with the Freedom Act in 2013, we curtailed the NSA's ability about that. Now, had Chairman Schiff decided to man up and come here and talk, rather than hiding behind Mr. Goldman as chief investigator, as his surrogate or legate, if you will, I think we could have gotten to the bottom of this, and we could have taken action to make sure that this never happens again. You know, I do not want to see members of Congress, through their subpoena power, being able to subpoena the telephone records of private citizens willy-nilly without any kind of cause, or to match the numbers up with somebody else to see who they were talking to, and then going the next step and publishing the results of that match in a report that the minority hadn't seen until it was released. That, I think, is an abuse of power. We're talking a lot about abuses of power here in the White House and in the executive branch. Here we see a clear abuse of power on the part of the people who are prosecuting this impeachment against the President of the United States. They should be ashamed of themselves. Now, I come from the state where Joe McCarthy came from. I met Joe McCarthy twice when I was first getting into politics as a teenager. Folks, you have made Joe McCarthy look like a piker with what you've done with the electronic surveillance involved. It is something that has to be put a stop to now. It is something that has to be fessed up to now, whether it's you, Mr. Goldman, that authorized the matching and the publication, or whether it was Chairman Schiff. I would have loved to put Chairman Schiff under oath so that he could be required to answer the same way you have Mr. Golden on how this all happened. But as one who has spent quite a bit of time curtailing the excesses of the Patriot Act, which I authored, with the Freedom Act, which I also authored, you know, the surveillance state can get out of control. This is a major step in the surveillance state getting out of control in the hands of the Congress and in the hands of a majority party that wants to influence political decisions relative to politicians, in this case President Donald Trump, that they don't like. And they haven't liked him from the beginning of his term. They have tried to talk about impeachment since the beginning of his term. They thought that the Mueller report was going to be the smoking gun. It ended up being a cap pistol. Now they're working on this. And the steps that they have gone, the violation of common sense, the precedent that they have started, and looking at the way the chairman has conducted this hearing today and in the previous hearings, not even to allow Mr. Getz to make a point of order that he can't see what you put on the screen, I think goes against the entire fabric, of American democracy. Shame on those who have done it. And if we want to get back to something objective, maybe it's time to push the recess button. I yield back.
Chairman Adler, could I just respond quickly on the phone
can
records?
respond.
Only because it's now come
Mr.
up.
Chairman, I yielded back.
No.
I didn't ask him a question. I made a statement.
The gentleman yielded back. The gentleman yielded back. Ms. Jackson-Lee is recognized.
So, Mr. Goldman, let's get to the facts again. During the phone conversation on July 25th with President Zelensky, President Trump was narrowly focusing on his own political survival, using his public office for private and political gain. The truth matters. Then we heard counsel for the Republicans say the president's concerned about foreign aid because you could kiss it goodbye, assuming that's referring to anti-corruption. But let's look at the facts of the July 25th call. I happen to have read it just recently, which sharply illustrates the president's willingness to abuse the power of his office for his own personal benefit. The memorandum of that call is on the screen in front of you, and it shows that President Trump says, and by the way, right after President Zelensky spoke about defense support and the javelins, I would like you to do us a favor, though. So, this is the president's own behavior and words. Mr. Goldman, what was that favor?
The favor was to investigate a debunked conspiracy theory related to Ukraine interference in the 2016 election. And
Mr. Goldman, the investigative committees received evidence from multiple witnesses who testified that President Trump was provided specific talking points in preparation for the July 25th call geared toward protecting the American people's national security. Is that correct?
The talking points certainly were part of the official U.S. policy, and they included anti-corruption efforts and national security efforts, yes.
And those talking points were provided to help the president effectively communicate official U.S. policy interests during calls with foreign leaders. Is that right?
That is correct. It's a routine process that the National Security Council does, but the president generally is able to use them or not use them. Witnesses said the president's not required to use them. What was so startling here is that he not only veered off from them, but that he went to his own personal interests.
And it is fair to say such talking points signal the purpose of a given call, correct?
Yes.
Witnesses testified that the talking points for the July 25th call included recommendations to encourage President Zelensky to continue to promote anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine, which has a focus of American foreign policy in Eastern Europe. Is that correct?
Yes.
So to be clear, the talking points created for the president or other principals to discuss specific matters that really protect the American people. Is that accurate?
Yes, generally.
But witnesses such as Tim Morrison, the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe, testified about what was not in those talking points.
Now, Mr. Morrison, were these references to CrowdStrike, the server, in 2016 election, and to Vice President Biden and his son, were they included in the president's talking points?
They were not.
Are you aware of any witness who testified that investigating the Bidens was an objective of official U.S. policy?
No, it was not before and it was not after this call.
And anything ever found of those investigations that might have occurred?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Anything ever found of those investigations that may have occurred with respect to the former vice president?
Every single witness said there's no factual basis for either of the investigations.
So Mr. Trump did not use official talking points?
Correct.
And there were fact witnesses who confirmed that?
That's right.
When you hear those words, do you hear the president requesting a thoughtful and well-calibrated anti-corruption program consistent with U.S. policy?
So, Mr. Goldman.
I do not.
We were hoping, we recommended the president very clearly support what President Zelensky had run on in his own election and what his Servant of the People Party had run on in its election, where it received a majority mandate.
But that didn't come up in the call, did it?
No, sir.
So, Mr. Goldman, did the evidence prove that Mr. Trump utilized his position of public trust in order to accomplish these goals, his goals, in order to hurt his domestic political opponent?
Yes, that's what the evidence showed.
I've come to understand that America's values of democracy and justice must have the vital pillars of truth, factual truth, and trust. As a former judge and one who sat on this committee during impeachment in 1998, the truth matters. It's clear that the president did not really care about fighting corruption in Ukraine, but wanted his own personal interests to be considered. That kind of puts in perspective Ambassador Sondland, that they didn't care whether Ukraine actually investigated, but really whether they just announced it. It is certainly well known that it is our duty, as the president poses a continuing threat, to, under the Constitution, pursue the truth. That is our duty. We are now proceeding to do our duty to find the truth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the second hearing on impeachment that this committee has held in the last week. Well, I would submit that you're investigating the wrong guy. Let's look at the facts. Mr. Castor, Ukraine, that's been at the center of attention in this impeachment hearing, has historically been one of the world's most corrupt nations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And under legislation that Congress passed, the National Defense Authorization Act, it was President Trump's responsibility, his duty, to see that U.S. tax dollars did not go to Ukraine unless they were making progress in reducing corruption. Is that also right?
Yes, that's right.
And isn't it true that Joe Biden's son, Hunter, had placed himself right smack dab in the middle of that corruption?
Yes, he did. Burisma was one of the most corrupt companies in Ukraine.
And contrary to what House Democrats and many in the media would have you believe, the concerns about Hunter Biden's involvement in Ukrainian corruption, they're not some sort of vast right-wing conspiracy concocted by supporters of the president, are they? In fact, the concerns about Hunter Biden were first raised by the Obama administration. Is that right?
That's right. And also Washington Post, a lot of publications, and the State Department.
And the Obama administration's concerns about Obama didn't end there, did they? The former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, said she was coached by the Obama administration on how to answer pesky questions related to Hunter Biden and Burisma that might arise during her Senate confirmation process. Is that right?
The State Department was so concerned about this, they gave her a mock Q&A on this question.
And nearly every single witness who testified at the Intelligence Committee impeachment inquiry agreed that Hunter Biden's Burisma deal created, at the very least, the appearance of conflict of interest. Is that correct?
That's correct. And, you know, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent testified that there was an investigation into Burisma, into their head, Zochevsky, and they were trying to track down $23 million that he had taken out of the country. They were working with the United Kingdom. They were working, United States, the United Kingdom. Ukraine was working on tracking this money down. And there was an investigation, an active investigation going on, and a bribe was paid. And that bribe was paid. It allowed Zlochevsky to get off scot-free. Right around that time is when Burisma went about sprucing up their board, shall we say.
And yet, with all that evidence, the Democrats on the Intelligence Committee under Chairman Schiff, and now the Democrats here, are determined to sweep the Biden corruption under the rug, ignore it, not let us call witnesses on it, and instead rush to impeach the president, all to satisfy, I would argue, their radical left-wing base. What a disservice to the country. Imagine this. You've got the Vice President, Joe Biden, in charge of overseeing our Ukrainian policy, and his son, Hunter Biden, receiving $50,000 a month with no identifiable expertise in either energy or Ukraine, yet the Democrats won't let us present witnesses on that. So let's do the next best thing since we can't bring the witnesses here. Let's watch a couple of videos.
You didn't have any extensive knowledge about natural gas or Ukraine itself, though?
No.
The list that you gave me of the reasons why you're on that board, you did not list the fact that you were the son of the vice president.
Yeah, no.
What role do you think that played?
I think that it is impossible for me to be on any of the boards that I just mentioned without saying that I'm the son of the Vice President of the United States.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of Burisma?
I don't know. I don't know. Probably not.
You know, Joe Biden got a little testy with a voter at one of his events in Iowa last week, calling the man a liar, challenging him to a push-up contest, among other things, and falsely stating once again that nobody said there was anything wrong with his son's deal in Ukraine. Well, you know what? That's a lot of malarkey. A lot of people have been saying that for quite a while now, and they're right. And what's worse is that first the Intelligence Committee and now this committee are conducting an impeachment investigation against President Trump based on, as Professor Turley put it last week, wafer-thin evidence and ignoring evidence of a high-level U.S. official who actually did engage in a quid pro quo with the Ukrainian government, in fact, confessed to it in this video.
I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here, and I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
You're investigating the wrong guy, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Goldman, I'd like to bring us back to the next president, not to this president, not the next president, and stay focused on the July 25 call and the president's abuse of office for his benefit and no one else's. Now, as my colleague, Ms. Jackson-Lee, confirmed, the president's request for these investigations was not an objective of U.S. foreign policy, correct?
That's right.
Is there any evidence that the National Security Council wanted an investigation into the Bidens, Burisma, or any alleged Ukrainian interference in 2016?
No.
Any evidence about the State Department wanting them?
No.
How about the DOD? Did the DOD want those investigations?
No evidence of that.
Did any witness tell you that they wanted Ukraine to investigate the Bidens of the 2016 election?
No.
And we certainly know now that the Ukrainians did not want it either. In fact, they made it very clear they did not want to be an instrument, this is a quote, an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics. So the only person who was a beneficiary from that investigation is President Trump. And that's why everyone on the July 25 call knew it was wrong. They knew it was wrong. The investigative committee heard testimony from 3 witnesses who participated in that call. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, listen to that call.
Right. Mr. Goldman, even in real time, the witnesses who listened on that call testified they were concerned by the call. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, both Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Mr. Morrison immediately reported the call to legal counsel. Is that right?
That's right.
And why did they do so?
They did it for separate reasons. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was concerned about the substance of the call, that it was improper. Mr. Morrison was concerned about the potential political ramifications if the call was released because of the substance of the call and the political nature of the call.
And they reported the call, that they actually reported that to the internal legal channels. Mr. Goldman, I've placed Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's testimony about why he reported the call on the screen. Am I correct his concern was based on the fact that the president was asking a foreign power to investigate a U.S. citizen?
Yes, and he was not the only witness to express that concern.
Am I also correct that he reported this concern because he thought it was a sense of duty, a duty that he felt something was wrong?
Yes, as you probably know, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is a Purple Heart Award winner from, or medal winner from Iraq, and he has been in the Department of Defense for 20 years and has a great sense of duty and a great patriotism to this country, and felt that he compelled to follow that sense of duty and report it.
And Ms. Williams, Vice President Pence's aide, was present for the call, and she testified, as you brought out, or was brought out earlier, that it was unusual and inappropriate. Is that correct?
That's right.
Now, when Mr. Vice President Biden got involved with the European Union and the IMF and Germany and France and said, you've got to do something about corruption, that was okay because they were doing something for the common good of a bunch of people, as distinguished from what's going on here, where somebody's doing it for their personal good. Is that not correct?
Right. There's a distinction between doing an official act for an official purpose and doing an official act for a personal purpose. And if I could just respond to something Mr. Castor said, when he said that the there were problems because Zlochevsky paid a bribe, the head of Burisma, in order to get out from under the prosecution. That was exactly the type of conduct that Vice President Biden wanted to shut down in Ukraine. That was exactly the type of non-anti-corruption policies that Vice President Biden was objecting to, using the official policy. So that's one of the reasons that I don't know if that was one, but that's the type of thing that he and the Americans and the Europeans based.
That's the issue we've got to get in this committee, to understand the difference between doing something for the national good, for the international good, for the common good, and for your own good. That's the difference. Got to get that across. And those witnesses, many career nonpartisan officials, were clear they thought it was wrong to ask a foreign government to investigate a political rival. Video.
To investigate the Vice President of the United States or someone who is a U.S. official, I don't think we should be asking foreign governments to do that. I would also say that's true of a political rival.
It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent.
It was improper and it was inappropriate, and we said that in real time.
Again, our holding up of security assistance that would go to a country that is fighting aggression from Russia for no good policy reason, no good substantive reason, no good national security reason is wrong.
And we are going to check that type of conduct. We are the people's house. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Goldman.
Well, I had some questions for the witness, Mr. Burke, but he has absconded. So I'm going to use my 5 minutes, but not to ask questions. It is interesting, though, to have heard Mr. Goldman refuse to answer a question about the investigation, yet he comes in here, and the very reason that he wants to see the president for the first time any president's ever been removed from office, why, he's been obstructing. He didn't answer our questions. So perhaps if we're going to apply his sense of justice to him, it would be time to have him removed from his position. But that's only if we apply his own standards. And as Chris Plant said, if it weren't for double standards, some of these folks wouldn't have standards at all. But we were told also at the beginning that we would hear lawyers present evidence. Lawyers are going to come in here. Now, what normally happens, and I've been in some kangaroo hearings in courts, not my own when I was there, but I have been mistreated in hearings before, but I have never seen anything like this where we don't allow the fact witnesses to come in here. We have the lawyers come in and tell us what we're supposed to know about those witnesses and about their testimony and about their impression and what the law is. This is outrageous. My friend Jim Sensenbrenner said in 41 years, he's never seen anything like what we have going on here to try to oust a sitting president. And it's also outrageous to hear people say, well, this man thought he was a king because he said he could do anything he wanted, when they know that that statement was in the context of whether or not he could fire Mueller. And of course he could fire Mueller. He could fire or not fire Mueller. He could appoint a special prosecutor to invest Mueller and Weissman. I think he should have. But that's his prerogative, and he could have done anything about that he wanted. To take that out of context, say he thinks he's a king. Let me tell you what a king is. A king is someone who says over 20 times, I can't do that. Congress has to change the law on immigration. And then he decides, you know what? I got a pen, I got a phone, I'll do whatever I want. And by golly, he does. He makes new law with a pen and a phone. Now that is more like a monarchy, not somebody saying they can fire a special prosecutor if they want to. And regarding treason, the Constitution itself says you got to have 2 witnesses. And that's not hearsay witnesses, none of this stuff that wouldn't be admissible in any decent court. No, that's 2 direct evidence witnesses that can come in and positively identify themselves, not something they overheard or something, but actually be witnesses to treason. And yet this group comes in here, they toss treason out in a report like it's no big deal. We can bring in a bunch of hearsay witnesses, and then we'll have the lawyers testify and then throw a president out of office. This is so absurd. It's so absurd. Now, we have a witness come in, and we're told he's going to be a witness. That's why he doesn't have to follow under the rules of decorum. And then, I've never seen this, he gets to come up and grill his opposing adversary witness. I feel like, to be fair, if we were going to make this thing fair, Mr. Castor would be able to come up and grill Mr. Burke. But this isn't about being fair. It's not about due process. This is about a kangaroo system. And let me tell you, those that think you've done something special here, you have set the bar so low, I'm afraid it's irreparable. I mean, just think, we've had people already mention, the next president, Joe Biden. We're told, gee, he may be the next president. Well, we've already got the forms. All we have to do is eliminate Donald Trump's name and put Joe Biden's name in there because he's on video, he and his son. He basically has admitted to the crime that's being hoisted on the president improperly. So I'm scared for my country, because I've never seen anything like this. This is supposed to be the Congress. I came up here from a court where we had order and we had rules, and I've seen nothing of the kind in here today, and it's outrageous that we're trying to remove a president with a kangaroo court like this. I yield back.
Chairman, if I could just clarify, treason is not in our report. I just want
The gentleman yielded back.
Yeah, and it is mentioned in the report we got. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yielded back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get us back to the undisputed facts of the president's abuse of power. Mr. Goldman, as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, when you prosecuted drug conspiracy cases, was it standard practice for drug kingpins to try to beat the case by distancing themselves from the conspiracy and blaming their accomplices for the crime?
All the time. Conspiracies have different layers, and the top layers make the bottom layers do the work so that they're further removed from the actual conduct.
Okay. I'd like to ask some questions about the president's role in what Ambassador Bolton referred to as a drug deal. Did the testimony and evidence compiled by the Intelligence Committee establish the fact that, with respect to Ukraine, Rudy Giuliani was at all times working on behalf of President Trump?
Yes, Mr. Giuliani said that. President Trump said that to a number of other individuals. And then those individuals, Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, also said that.
Thank you. And on May 9th, 2019, Rudy Giuliani, on behalf of his client, President Trump, spoke with a New York Times reporter about his planned trip to Ukraine. And on that trip, he planned to meet with President Zelensky, he said, and urged him to pursue investigations relating to the Bidens and to the debunked theory that Ukraine and not Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
And Mr. Giuliani told the reporter that his trip was not about official U.S. foreign policy and that the information he sought would be very, very helpful to his client, meaning it would be helpful to President Trump. Is that correct?
Yes, and if it's not official foreign policy, it would be helpful to President Trump's personal interests.
That's correct. And there is no doubt, Mr. Goldman, that investigations of the Bidens and the 2016 election meddling were, in fact, not about U.S. policy, but were about benefiting Trump's reelection, correct?
Yes, and even the Ukrainians realize that.
And on July 25th, President Trump placed that fateful phone call to President Zelensky, and he asked President Zelensky to investigate the Bidens, correct?
Yes.
And on that call, President Trump told Zelensky, quote, "I will have Mr. Giuliani to give you a call," correct?
That's right.
And on October 2nd and October 3rd, President Trump once again made explicit that he and Mr. Giuliani were intent on making these investigations happen, correct?
Yes.
And just so you know,
And
we've been investigating on a personal basis through Rudy and others, lawyers, corruption in the 2016 election.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
Mr. Goldman, the evidence shows a course of conduct by President Trump and his agents, does it not?
It does, and clearly it continued long after our investigation began.
It shows a common plan, correct?
That's right, yes.
It shows a common goal.
Correct.
And the goal was to get foreign help for the 2020 election, correct?
That's what all the witnesses said.
And Mr. Goldman, who was the kingpin of that plan?
President Trump.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Ambassador Bolton called it a drug deal. As a kingpin, President Trump tried to force a foreign government to interfere in the upcoming presidential election. The evidence is undisputed and overwhelming that Rudy Giuliani acted as part of a conspiracy with President Trump to obtain Ukrainian help for President Trump in the 2020 election. This was not just a hurtful drug deal. This was an attempt to undermine the very fabric of our democracy. The framers feared most how foreign influence could turn a president into a despot. So they adopted impeachment as a backstop to protect our democracy. The facts, ladies and gentlemen, demand that we use that remedy today. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castor, I want to go to the document that started it all, the August 12th whistleblower complaint. Bullet point 1 on page 1 of the whistleblower's complaint, he says this: over the past 4 months, more than half a dozen U.S. officials have informed me of the various facts related to this effort. Mr. Castor, who are these half a dozen U.S. officials?
We don't know.
We don't know, do we? We had no chance to know for sure who these people were because we never got to talk to the whistleblower. Is that right, Mr. Castor?
That's right.
We needed to talk to the guy who started it all. We needed to talk to him to figure out who these more than half a dozen people were who formed the basis of his complaint, and we never got to. Adam Schiff's staff got to. Adam Schiff knows who he is, but we don't get to know, and therefore we don't get to know the original people, the 6 people who formed the basis of this entire thing we've been going through now for 3 months. But we did talk to 17 people, right, Mr. Castor?
That's right.
17 depositions, and you were in every single one. You were the lawyer doing the work for the Republicans in every single one. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And there's one witness who they relied on and built their report around. One witness. Who would that witness be? As I read their report, it's obviously one witness. Who's that witness, Mr.
Ambassador
Castor?
Sondland.
Ambassador Sondland. I think you said earlier his name was mentioned, I don't know, what did you say?
611 times.
611 times. More than Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, the guy who was on the call. More than Ambassador Taylor, their first witness, their star witness, the very first hearing in the Intelligence Committee. They relied on Sondland, not the whistleblower, not the more than half a dozen people who informed the whistleblower. They relied on Ambassador Sondland. Why'd they pick Sondland, Mr. Castor?
That's probably the best they got.
Because that's the best they got. The guy who had to file an addendum to his testimony, the guy that had to file the clarification, the guy who said 2 weeks ago, sitting in the same chair you're sitting in, Mr. Castor, in his 23-page opening statement, he said this: unless President Zelensky announces an investigation into Burisma and the Bidens, there would be no call with President Trump, there'd be no meeting with President Trump, there'd be no security assistance money going to Ukraine. That's what Ambassador Sondland said. Mr. Castor, was there an announcement by President Zelensky about investigating the Bidens or Burisma?
No.
No announcement.
No.
Did President Zelensky get a call from President Trump?
Yes.
Did President Zelensky get a meeting with President Trump?
Yes.
Did President Zelensky get the money from the United States?
Yes.
They got the call on July 25th. They got the money on September 11th. They got the meeting on September 25th. Is that right?
Yes.
But the guy who said none of that was going to happen is the guy they built their case around.
Yes.
Is that right, Mr. Sondland?
Yep.
Let me go to one other thing they built their case around. They built their case around a lot of hearsay, didn't they? And the best example of the hearsay, surprisingly enough, is Ambassador Sondland. It's amazing. They built their case around this ambassador, and they built their case around hearsay, and the best example of both is Mr. Sondland, Ambassador Sondland, because he filed his addendum, his clarification, where he says this. We read this a couple weeks ago. We pointed this out a couple weeks ago. He says this in bullet point number 2. In his clarification, he says, Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on a September 1st, 2019, in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. That's his clarification. Amazing. 6 people, as I said before, having 4 conversations in one sentence. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 2019, in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. That's the clarification. That's their star witness who they built their case around. So-and-so tells so-and-so what somebody said to someone else, and there you have it. That's their case. They forget the 4 key facts. They forget the fact that we have the call transcript and there was no quid pro quo. They forget the fact the 2 guys on the call, President Trump and President Zelensky, have said repeatedly there was no pressure, no linkage, no pushing. They forget the fact Ukraine didn't even know aid was held at the time of the call. And they forget the fact, most important, they did nothing to get the aid released, no announcement of any type of investigation whatsoever. They forget all that, those key facts. And they build their case around the guy who had to clarify his testimony with that amazing sentence. Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman, did the Democrats publish phone records of the president's attorney?
Mr. Giuliani, yes.
Did the Democrats publish phone records of a member of the press?
Yes, who was also involved in this.
Did the Democrats publish phone records of a member of Congress?
Yes, who was talking to people involved.
Did the Democrats, does that member of Congress also happens to be your boss's political opponent that those phone records were published of? So the Democrats, they run this kind of investigation, ignoring the facts, not letting the whistleblower come in, and therefore not letting us know if we've talked to the more than half a dozen original sources for the whistleblower's complaint in the first place. The guy has to file an addendum with that clarification sentence. But one thing they did do in their report is they published the phone records of the president's personal lawyer, the phone records of a member of the press, and the phone records of the chairman of the Intelligence Committee's political opponent, Representative Nunes. That's what these guys did. And that's their effort to impeach the President of the United States 11 months before an election.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I ask
Deutsch.
unanimous consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to focus on the facts surrounding the president's abuse of power.
Gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the report by the majority staff of the House Committee on the Judiciary Constitutional Grounds for Presidential Impeachment that talks about treason and bribery be admitted for the record.
Be what?
Be made part of our record.
Majority report without objection.
Thanks.
Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you. Getting back to the facts surrounding the president's abuse of power using the White House meeting as leverage for helping his political campaign. Mr. Goldman, President Trump offered Ukrainian President Zelensky a meeting in the White House. But first, he wanted investigations into the Bidens and a conspiracy theory about meddling in the 2016 election. You testified that the committees found evidence that President Trump worked to exchange official actions for personal benefit, and I want to talk about that. On May 23rd, 2019, a delegation of officials returned from Zelensky's inauguration and they briefed the president. In that briefing, President Trump directed government officials to work with his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And Trump's hand-picked Ukraine operator, Gordon Sondland, testified that they faced a choice, either work with Giuliani or abandon the goal of a White House meeting. What choice did they make, Mr. Goldman?
They decided to work with Mr. Giuliani.
Right. And 6 days later, on May 29th, President Trump sent the new Ukrainian president a letter that said America stood with Ukraine and invited President Zelensky to visit the White House. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that was the second time that he invited him to the White House.
So at this point, the Ukrainian president expected that meeting.
Correct.
But then they learned that they've got to do something more for the president. Sondland testified that there was a prerequisite of investigations. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And NSC staffer Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that Sondland told the Ukrainians in a July 10th meeting that investigation of the Bidens was a deliverable necessary to get that meeting. Isn't that right?
Yes, and if I could just take a second to correct what Mr. Castor said about that meeting, there really is no inconsistent statements about whether or not Ambassador Sondland raised the issue of investigations in connection to the White House. Even Ambassador Volker, in his public testimony, was forced to admit that he did hear that, and he said it was inappropriate.
And in fact, on July 19th, Sondland told President Zelensky directly that President Trump wanted to hear a commitment to the investigations on the July 25th call, correct?
That's right.
That same day, Sondland updated multiple Trump administration officials that Zelensky was, quote, prepared to receive POTUS's call and would offer assurances about the investigations. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And on that same day, State Department official Volker had breakfast with Rudy Giuliani, and he reported to Sondland by text message, most important is for Zelensky to say he will help investigation, right?
Yes, and address any specific personnel issues.
Right, and later that day, after Giuliani spoke with Yermak, evidence suggested Giuliani gave a green light to that July 25th call. Then on the morning of the call, Volker texted Zelensky aide Yermak, and that text to his aide said, and I quote, heard from White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down a date for visit to Washington. And the transcript released by President Trump shows Trump requests investigations and Zelensky agrees. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and that text message was actually a direction, a message relayed from President Trump himself.
And then after the July 25th call, members of the administration continued to follow up with their Ukrainian counterparts to prepare for the announcement of investigations. Sondland texted Volker about efforts to schedule a White House visit, noting that POTUS really wants the deliverable. And that was just one of many messages during a flurry of follow-up activity. There were meetings and calls and texts on July 26th and July 27th and August 2nd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 8th, and 9th, August 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 15th. Mr. Goldman, August 16th, 17th, and August 19th. Isn't that correct?
Yes, including to Secretary Pompeo as well.
Here's the point. These are our government officials who work for us. Instead, they were working hard to help the president advance his personal political interests. Isn't that what you found, Mr. Goldman?
That's right.
This isn't a close call. We had a Ukrainian president at war with Russia, desperate for a White House meeting. The president promised a White House meeting, but then he blocked the Oval Office. He blocked it and said, I need a favor. Not a favor to help America, a favor to help me get reelected. Our framers feared one day we would face a moment like this. They gave us an impeachment, and they gave us impeachment as a safety valve, not to punish the president, but to defend our elections and our Constitution, and that's what we must do. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castor, I want to direct your attention to page 3 of the telephone call dated July 25th between President Trump and President Zelensky. On page 3, President Trump states, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. Later, he says, I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I would like you to get to the bottom of it. The majority report on page 13 says, the U.S. intelligence community had unanimously determined that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 election to help the candidacy of President Trump. Mr. Castor, there appears to be a conflict there. President Trump is asking the Ukraine to investigate something. The majority has decided that it's an illegitimate request because there was no interference in an election by the Ukraine. Is that how you read this?
Yes.
And the press release from the majority on their report says, as part of this scheme, President Trump, acting in his official capacity and using his position of public trust, personally and directly requested that the President of Ukraine, that the government of Ukraine publicly announce investigations into, subsection 2, a baseless theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 U.S. election. Is that true?
Yes.
And Mr. Castor, I want to ask you something. Have you seen this article from Politico dated January 11, 2017?
Yes, I have.
And the title of that article is Ukrainian Efforts to Sabotage Trump Backfire. Is that correct?
Yes.
I want to read you the second paragraph. Ukrainian government officials tried to help Hillary Clinton and undermine Trump by publicly questioning his fitness for office. They also disseminated documents implicating a top Trump aide in corruption and suggested they were investigating the matter only to back away after the election. And they helped Clinton's allies research damaging information on Trump and his advisors, a Politico investigation found. Isn't it true that President Trump had a legitimate reason to request help from the Ukraine about the 2016 election? And I'm not suggesting for a minute that Russia didn't interfere. Of course they interfered. But the Ukraine officials tried to influence the election.
Yes.
Let's move on to Ambassador Sondland. I only have 10 fingers and 10 toes, so I can't count above 20, Mr. Castor. But you know how many times Ambassador Sondland said that he did not know, did not recall, had no recollection, had limited memory, or failed to remember something in his October 17th testimony? You know how many times? 325. Does that surprise you? 325.
Big number.
And then he files a clarifying statement, and he clarifies a few things, I guess. But did you have any contact with Ambassador Sondland between the time of his deposition and the time of his clarifying statement?
No.
Did the majority?
I have no idea.
You have no idea. So they may have had influence on his testimony.
I did.
And that would be evidence of bias. That would be evidence of credibility. That would be evidence that we should take into account before. But we'll never know, will we? Because the majority counsel has a right to assert a privilege as to information that's relevant to this committee's decision. The majority counsel has a right to assert a privilege in any communications he has with the chairman, Adam Schiff, doesn't he? As does minority counsel. That's a privilege that we've reserved here in Congress, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the same thing is true of FOIA. The Freedom of Information Act does not apply to memos that majority counsel writes. Isn't that true?
Correct.
So we've demanded that of the executive branch, but we have allowed ourselves not to be part of FOIA, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so the majority has a privilege. The president also has a privilege. It's called executive privilege. He can meet with the Secretary of State, and that's a privileged conversation. He can meet with the Secretary of Defense. That's a privileged conversation. He can meet with the Secretary of Energy. That's a privileged conversation. Now, when the majority has subpoenaed those witnesses, and the president has refused to produce those witnesses or relevant documents, or what they consider relevant documents, they are charging him with an article of impeachment for obstruction. In fact, their report says, President obstructed the impeachment inquiry by instructing witnesses to ignore subpoenas. Why?